Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.
It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show reminding you that if you're good at something, never do it for free. I'm Christy Powell. My co-host tonight is the flagship producer of the Atheist Experience Network. Welcome, Johnny P. Angel.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you back. And Johnny and I are joined tonight by the SecX patron saint of sex work, our very own Arden Hart.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Love to be here.
Well, you know, tonight we're taking on the legal temperature. We're taking it and taking it on. The legal temperature of sex for sale. So call in with your questions and comments and stories at 512-991-9242 or connect with your computer on tiny.cc/call SEX because the show is coming on right now.
All right. Well, that sound means that we are starting this week. We do every week with what's turning us on this week. Arden, Johnny, super excited to have you both back. Arden, I'm going to let you go first. What's got you turned on this week?
Oh, man. What's got me turned on this week is that I started a new form of hormones, right? I had been for the last year, every single week, self-injecting. And while it worked better, I definitely was happier with it than what I was happy with before. It started to get old. There's a lot of anxiety sometimes around self-injection. So my doctor is one of the few practitioners who are trying this like newer method of hormone delivery for trans people where they implant you with a tiny little like implant that has hormones in it, and they put a little incision on your butt and they stick it in, and eventually capillaries grow in, I guess, and start to draw the hormone out of the pellet. So I have been stable and maybe even a little more in the mood thanks to some balanced hormone levels.
Awesome. No, glad to hear it. I've definitely heard that the butt pellet is a lot more fun than stabbing yourself with a needle every week. So congratulations. Hope it works well for you.
Thank you.
And Johnny, what's got you turned on this week?
I am excited about having you and Laura and Arden, I think, was it Arden and Nate, over on the Valentine's Day show over on the nonprofits.
Mm-hmm.
We've got some topics here. We've got the grim history of Valentine's Day. We've got strange Valentine's Day traditions around the world. Some of them are just cute, not really strange. We've got a segment on those who don't like Valentine's Day, who don't feel in the mood to make merry on a holiday where they just don't feel that good. And that's all right, too. And then we have coverage of shit internet apologists say they've always got to open their mouths and they don't put anything good in it. They let all kinds of sewage come out. And they're saying that it's unchristian to celebrate the holiday at all. And so we're going to talk about that. And that's going to be this Sunday at 3 p.m. Central Time, in between Talk Heathen, which I will be on, and AXP, which I will not.
See, that's what makes you the flagship producer, like always cross-promoting, like always trying to put it out there. But yeah, it was a really fun conversation, and I'm excited for the episode. Check that out, the nonprofits on Sunday.
It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Super glad for it. I'm glad to have y'all here because I am really excited to try and untangle a really complicated subject. I'm going to just go ahead and say that the more I read about this topic of how we as a nation, as a society, and how our government should consider prostitution and how to keep everybody safe while respecting everybody's rights, honestly, the longer we do this show, the more interviews that we get to do on this topic, the more I read about this topic, the less convinced that I know anything about anything. So I was
Mm.
really excited to have the two of you here. I know that you've both done a bunch of research to try and present the best possible argument or understanding of this issue. But I think we can go ahead and acknowledge at the top, this is weird and confusing, and we don't have
Mhm.
great data. And fuck if anybody knows what the hell they're talking about. Everybody
Yeah.
seems to have an agenda, and hopefully we can sort it all out. But yeah, it's a thorny topic.
The one thing I think I can say with some confidence is the rest of it I really don't know exactly. There's not enough data, not enough reliable data, too much agenda going around. Is that the practitioners of sex work probably don't need to face legal consequences for that work. I think
Sure.
what those folks need is support and a way out and a way into other areas of other ways of making money if they want it. Because my research showed that, and again, the data is unclear, that an overwhelming majority of the people who are engaged in sex work are not folks who are doing it with full consent, that they're doing it. A lot of people do it out of desperation. They're coerced, they're cajoled, they're forced to do so. And those are the people that I'm concerned about. I'm of course concerned about folks who do it because they want to, and those people should be protected and have the best possible life and have all rights available to them. But I think my spotlight is on those people who are being trafficked personally.
And it's certainly tricky. Arden,
Mhm.
actually, let me let you jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I definitely share your concerns, right? Like,
Mhm.
I don't want people to be trapped in an industry doing work that they're unhappy with, potentially engaging in acts that make them uncomfortable or maybe exacerbate like mental or physical health because they're not okay with what they're doing. I want those people to have a way to get out of that or to get out of the situation that got them to doing sex work in the first place. If that's like an impetus, yeah, you were definitely giving a nod towards economic uh, situations being coercive, and I think they definitely can be. That said, I think from what I've read up on, it seems to me that decriminalization might be the best path forward to giving those people the tools to get out of that situation. But I realize there's some still disagreement on the topic, and that's what we're here to chat about tonight. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited about the notion of there possibly being some disagreement between all of us because that's usually not something that we get to do on this show. But this is such a complex issue. But let's start by saying that at least one of the reasons that I wanted to bring all this up is because a friend of the show and world famous escort Alice Little told me that the state of Oregon is currently considering decriminalization statewide. And I bring up Alice because before she mentioned it, I was completely unaware. And even after doing a lot of Googling, I still feel incredibly uninformed on what may or may not be moving forward there. Considering no state has moved to make any like meaningful change in prostitution laws in at least the last 50 years, why do y'all suppose there's so little coverage over this topic right now?
Well, if I'm being extremely charitable, I went to I went to Ballotpedia where they will often do a full breakdown of every politician that is running on a given ticket, and they'll often go over ballot propositions as well. And after enough scrolling, I was able to find that this ballot initiative is still technically pending. It doesn't look like it's gotten totally cleared yet to be on the ballot, unless that's changed since I was googling. But as you pointed out, Christy, I was doing so much Google sleuthing the past 2 days, and this story seems to be very suppressed. And I don't want to get conspiratorial. I'm not gonna like, levy any accusations that it's being intentionally suppressed or anything like that. But certainly it's hard to find information. I would have to say again, charitable interpretation. It hasn't technically been approved yet for the ballot. Maybe
Mhm.
that is the best generous interpretation of the situation I can give as of right now.
Sure. And that may explain it, but I mean, in the show notes to this episode, I think I ended up linking like a student newspaper and a local newspaper. I mean, certainly the primary sources that I was after were maybe not of the rigor that I would hope for something that seemingly is so important. But then maybe it is because a similar ballot measure was pulled last year after it became clear that it was not going to pass. So maybe it just isn't realistic that passage of this bill or anything similar is coming in the next couple of years. Do y'all feel like that might be a part of this problem or a part of why at least we're not talking about it as much?
It may be. It's really hard to know for sure, but I do think there is a thing when it comes to passing laws, right? Where oftentimes it requires multiple attempts. And I mean, and we see this
Sure.
inversely from the religious right, where they'll try to fund a bill that would make it so teachers can't talk about X, Y, or Z, and doesn't pass the first time, but they rework it a little bit, and the next session they introduce it again, and that one goes through. So I think it's probably part of the process to some degree to not always have the first your first attempt work. There often, there
Sure.
can be small things about verbiage that can make a ballot not feasible. It's hard to know exactly why, but I think it's worth taking a note out of that religious right playbook of it would be unfortunate if this doesn't go through. I think from what I've read, it seems to be a good measure, but if it doesn't, we can rework it, try it again next year. Of course, I would love it to happen, at the end of this year, but we don't always get what we want. So
Sure.
working in reality.
Yeah, well, and if this were to move forward, I mean, right now, there are only 10 counties in this entire country where prostitution is legal. I mean, those 10 counties are clustered mostly in very rural Nevada. So it's kind of hard to imagine as something as huge and potentially transformative as this Oregon decrim bill ever actually happening. What kind of impact do you imagine this could have should it ever get over the finish line?
Well, I mean that's probably kind of part of what we're going to debate, right? It's hard to know exactly what the outcome is going to be. The
Sure.
ballot measure looks good to me. They've also got set aside that if this were to pass, there would be a committee established that would be reviewing how funds were spent and if any of the claims that they made about reduction of harm would actually be demonstrable at that point. Um, it, it seems to me from the evidence that I've worked with that this would be a good thing, but it is really hard to know. And until we try something different, all we can say is that what we're doing right now isn't working. When we're
I
seeing,
think that's fair to say.
yeah, some of the data that I saw was suggesting that of arrests relating to prostitution, like 71% in Oregon were sellers themselves. It
Mm.
was only about 5.2% that were actually related to human trafficking. So if that data is actually to be trusted, it seemed pretty good to me. A lot of it was coming from the Oregon State Police. Um, then I would think that decriminalization would be a good thing. Prisoners famously cost tax dollars quite a lot. So there could be a lot of benefits to it, but there might be unforeseen harms as well. Yeah.
Yeah, Johnny, is there any way for us to wrap our head around how significant this bill would be if it were to pass or something similar in the near future, effectively decriminalizing for an entire state? How significant do you think that would be?
I think it would be quite significant because I think it would change the landscape of how individuals how they conduct that business. You would be able to be much more in the open. You could probably advertise in reputable those who would have them. I'm sure there's going to be some periodicals, websites that wouldn't allow them to come on, but I know they were taken off of different websites over the years. Sex workers were taken off because of legal reasons. Those legal reasons would be gone, and you would see them back on. I think it was Craigslist. I know there was something about Backpage a couple of years ago.
Hmm.
I think you'd see that being more in the open would certainly be more protective of the individuals who um, are practicing sex work. And much like the legalization of marijuana, it might make it difficult for those trying to skirt the rules to make a living because they don't need protection necessarily. They could practice it in broad daylight, so to speak. In California, you have dispensaries. So you could potentially have open brothels. And I mean, I have very mixed feelings about this, of course,
Sure.
but that's a benefit, I think. Shedding light on this, because the whole nature of this industry is that a lot of it takes place behind closed doors, that people are
That's certainly true.
afraid to turn to authorities, to those agencies that are tasked with protecting us, and eliminating that consequence of themselves getting in trouble for even acknowledging themselves or admitting that they are engaged in sex work could go a long way to rooting out the nasty parts of this industry.
Well, is there any reason to believe that whether it's this bill in Oregon or some of the maybe half dozen other that are at least tangentially or vaguely being considered in other states, is there any reason to believe that there is in the current atmosphere a appetite or a desire for change? I mean, I remember just about a year ago, we covered on this show, again, Alice Little's petition against, or lawsuit rather, against the governor of Nevada, basically just trying to get the brothels there to be under the same COVID-19 restrictions as every other comparable business. And that lawsuit was dismissed pretty handedly. Nobody was really interested in making sure that the legal sex workers there had the same protections that other people would have. I don't know if that can really be extrapolated across the entire country, but I'm not so convinced that there is a desire to see meaningful reform here. Does that feel true to y'all?
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I mean, it kind of like you mentioned at the beginning of the show, Christy, like until this ballot measure was brought to my attention for the purposes of this show, I hadn't heard of this. And I like to think of myself as a relatively plugged in person, but I think there have been certainly strong feelings amongst sex workers, of friends of mine and myself, and I think LGBT people, marginalized people generally, that these sort of reforms would be good and important. That said, I can't say that I see a really significant movement in the same vein that like LGBT rights has really grown to a massive scale. You know, it's on national news stories all over all the time. We
Mhm.
don't see that kind of attention being given to sex workers' rights. So I think that maybe there isn't a current appetite, but I think maybe this is indicative of something that is important to the people. I mean, as the ballot measure claimed, there were, I think, over 50% of Oregonians supported the measure and supported the last one, the HB 3088. So there is feelings there. I think people do care about this issue, but it's maybe not the most pressing one on some people's minds.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to think that with the prevalence of OnlyFans in the last couple of years and other forms of sex work becoming, I don't know if democratized is maybe the best word to use, but becoming more socially acceptable in a lot of ways, that it would stand to reason that we could be working towards something along these lines. But I guess I'm just not convinced that we really see that happening right now. Uh,
No,
yeah,
with
William.
legislation protecting the LGBTQ community, the only real arguments that are proposed are bigot, icky arguments by shitheels, or religious arguments by people with 3,000-year-old morality. With this sex work, and I mean that with the greatest love, 3,000-year-old morality. With the sex work issue, look at us three. You know, the more we research into this, the cloudier it gets.
Sure.
And what you have here are these initiatives that would change the way we treat an industry's way of doing business. that has been in place for, a very, 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 very long time. And I think there are legitimate concerns of people being victimized, being trafficked, um, that doesn't prey upon prudishness. Because the
Mm,
prudishness argument doesn't hold any water for me. Go fuck
sure.
yourself,
Yeah.
But the I'm worried about people being, kidnapped or sold by parents. I think that's a legitimate humanist claim. And much like I'm not an economist, so I can't really say what's the best regulatory scheme. I don't. I'm not a law enforcement expert. I'm not. There's a regimen here. There's a regime of law enforcement, of protections, a legal scheme that could work most effectively. And I think there's a balancing act that we would need to to strike. There's a balance that needs to be struck between, where are the rights going to? The right of the individual to exercise their bodily autonomy. Do we want to have these things happen openly in the public square, with the full knowledge that, that could result in nastiness behind the scenes, or do we want to keep it behind the scenes entirely where the nastiness is already taking place?
Right.
I really don't know. I don't. I'm very suspicious that legalization or decriminalization, as I've seen it, is is really going to completely eliminate the abuses in the system. And I want to know what's most effective, because maybe there's a certain amount of ugliness that's going to exist.
And well, I definitely empathize with that. And I think
Hmm.
as we talked about at the beginning of the show, we want the same things, that
Hmm.
human trafficking is bad. I can say that objectively. Human trafficking
Right.
is bad, and the decriminalization or legalization of sex work should necessarily include protections to make sure that sex trafficking isn't happening. We don't want that either.
Yeah.
Just because we want the right to freely be able to practice sex work does not mean that I want impunity for people who might be trafficking humans. That's
Hmm.
obviously horrible. But I think there's so much fear of any of that happening that we aren't
Yeah.
doing anything. And when we're looking
Yeah.
at the stats right now from the Oregon Human Rights Commission released a report that was kind of the impetus for this ballot measure to be pushed through. That was suggesting how little of arrests that are made with regard to the selling of sex actually and it had anything to do with human trafficking, and that the majority was criminalizing the sellers or the people who
Hmm.
helped the sellers, which
Hmm.
granted could be anyone from a pimp who is maybe not treating people correctly to a friend who is helping out in the house with them.
Right.
So there, I think while I agree that there are definitely concerns and that this might not reduce human trafficking, right now we're not really helping human trafficking. We are just criminalizing perfectly innocent
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Well,
And I agree.
we're
I,
going to keep diving into maybe what the best solution is or what to do about it. But I guess what I'm curious about, Arden, I kind of heard you weigh in on this, but ultimately, does this current moment feel sustainable? The model that we have now, regardless of what we're headed to or what that should look like, is it at all conscionable to keep doing what we're doing, or is it better to deal with the issues that we know rather than taking on something that could have a lot of unintended consequences and making like massive change here?
is the devil you know versus the devil you don't.
Sure.
I think it's worth a try. You said, is it sustainable? And the answer is, yeah, sexism and racism has been sustainable for
Yeah.
10,000 years. So this way we're doing things is definitely sustainable. We can keep on doing it and pointing the blame at service providers if we want to. But I do think that I'm a little bit of a um, harsh person when it comes to crime. Now, I understand, and I did my research, that a lot of the people that are in the procuring business are themselves the victims of abuse
Sure.
and other ugliness that humanity inflicts upon themselves. I actually know someone whose son's father was a pimp, and his father was a pimp, and his grandfather was a pimp. And my friend was concerned that her son was going to maybe not be a pimp, but at the very least be engaged in exploiting people, whatever that might
Sure.
mean, right? And so tried to break the cycle. And I'm concerned about that a lot because it's like, where do you grab what thread do you pull? Our society is functions. It's sustainable in some form, but it's also very broken.
Hmm.
And I do think that. So when I say I'm a little bit harsh, I really want to see those who inflict those abuses, right? Not the friend who's helping manage sex workers or a cooperative of sex workers who are just trying to, they watch each other's backs and they pay for marketing costs. But the ugly ones, the boyfriends or whoever, who are saying, "Oh, you're so beautiful. It would be just wonderful if you'd come to me," because that's my research shows. A lot of times it starts with a dishonest person who tries to lure girls. They talked about an example of a guy walks up to a group of girls and said, "Oh, you're so beautiful." And the girl who looks down to her shoes, and I'm using girls for an example because that was the example that was in the podcast that I listened to, that's the one he goes for. Preys upon our vulnerability. We all have it, but those people are poisonous serpents among society, and they themselves have been poisoned by something, right? And my natural animal instinct is throw the fucking book at those pieces of shit. On the other hand, I recognize that no one exists in a vacuum, and there's a cause to that person's behavior as well. So I'd rather see the worst actors attacked, And while there's discussion, what I did watch some research, and Arden and I had a conversation about this. We actually talked about this before, a couple months ago, I think, about legalization versus decriminalization. But in Amsterdam, the government, the Netherlands, looked back and saw that the brothels in Amsterdam were run entirely or majority by organized crime, and that there were examples of people being trafficked from around the world, vulnerable populations being pulled into sex work. And because the police weren't looking at them, they were able to behave with impunity right out in the open. And they would pretend to be bodyguards, but in fact, they were prisoners, or prison guards in some respects. I don't know if that's true, but what I can say is that you can set up standards for behavior. And you can say if a person, although you might be able to operate a brothel, there are certain standards that you have to meet, and maybe focus the spotlight on the procurers, on the managers, on those people, and maybe leave the workers alone. Now, I don't know what you do about co-ops. No idea. I actually don't have any idea on what the answer is. And I think you were saying, Christy, we have a nation of 50 states and a couple territories. Let's see. Let's
solve some of that
Yeah.
data problem by
Yeah.
actually experimenting and seeing what fits. I definitely appreciate that idea. And I guess I want to just highlight and give y'all both a chance to respond to what I'm maybe noticing as the distinction between y'all's two perspectives, which is that on the one hand, you have basically almost every, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but nearly all sex workers' rights groups favoring decriminalization because it will, in most situations or very likely, benefit current sex workers to be operating under that model. But what I maybe hear from you, Johnny, is that the concern is not necessarily just about current sex workers, but the folks that might find themselves in that situation or put into that position if we were to change some of the regulations around all of this. Is
Yeah.
that maybe a fair way of framing some of the space between y'all here?
Maybe. It's up to Arden. But I know that there's a racial component and a class component here that the advocates for decriminalization seem to not address as directly as I'd like to see.
Sure.
And it's if you are one of the people that was speaking, and we were sharing videos earlier today, was saying there was a criticism of this person. I wish I had the person's name. Maybe Arden has it. It's like it was an ad an advocate, a public speaker going on tours, and someone had accused her of not being representative of the average sex worker.
Mm.
And she did a little soft shoe side dance and said, well, what is the average sex worker? I mean, it's people middle class, and it's this and it's that. And all I can think of is 13-year-old girls and boys in Thailand. That's what I think of, because she's not speaking for them. In my eyes, she's not. She's speaking for people like her. Is she speaking for people in economically disadvantaged areas, perhaps African American or Latino, in big cities who are walking the streets, and are maybe have heavy drug problems? Or are they talking about the, all due respect, Alice Littles of the world, people who are pulling in $1 million working at the Bunny Ranch?
Hmm.
Good for her, right?
Yeah,
I'm worried
I think
about
philosophically we're all on board with that idea existing, but it's protecting the other folks. But
Yeah.
Arden, why don't you weigh in here before we jump on the phones?
Yeah, I'm antsy. Let me just be like a person to say that like this is overwhelmingly a race issue, right? The
Mm.
Oregon Human Rights Report that was the incentive for this bill, the ballot proposition rather, showed that when it came to people who were arrested for selling sex, African Americans
Yeah.
were 8 times more likely to be arrested than white people, right? If you think that's crazy, wait till you hear the next number. Of people who were arrested for helping selling sex, Black people were 17 times more likely to be arrested. So this is overwhelmingly a racial issue. I think there were also some stats that I don't have them off the top of my head because I'm still, I just barely read this report today and it's still a little fresh in my mind, but I
Mhm.
believe that one of the biggest demographics who actually gets trafficked were migrants. So
Yeah.
yeah, like
Absolutely.
beyond the shadow of a doubt, this is definitely a highly racialized issue. People who get into sex work, we always talk about it's a low barrier to entry, and high pay. They're going to be people who are from marginalized groups and from lower class,
Sure.
like economically.
Mhm.
That's what's going to pull you out of poverty a lot of the time. But unfortunately, the fact that it's criminalized is what keeps a lot of people stuck in that industry. And there are fears, and I think that have been demonstrated with issues with like the Nordic model, for example, with like legalization, where there kind of becomes a two-tier system, where there are people who often the more affluent sex workers who happen to be more white, they get their licenses, they get their ability to do sex work legally, but then the poor marginalized people who are the most oppressed by law enforcement and society for being sex workers don't have as easy of an avenue to get into the legal sex work and are therefore still in the same exact spot that they are with the current system. So definitely this is a racial issue, but
Mhm.
from what I've read, it seems to be that decriminalization would be the most effective at addressing that I've heard of so far. It's not to say
Yeah.
that there wouldn't be a more effective method proposed, but it seems to me that legalization has some issues with aiding with the racial component, whereas decriminalization is specifically tailored to address the issues of
Works well in
how,
that aspect. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
before we go to calls, can I ask one question, Christy?
Sure.
Or we can go call. There's decriminalization, and then there's total decriminalization. There's a
Sure. Yeah.
difference,
Is there room
right?
for a blended model here? And I think
Yeah.
that's probably going to be at least somewhat inevitable. And we'll talk through some of those particulars. I guess the last seed I want to plant here is just to acknowledge that everything we're talking about when we're considering the fears around sex trafficking and of minorities being trafficked into and out of countries other than their nation of origin, that our numbers are almost garbage. I don't want to dismiss all of the data that has been collected. I do want to say that it is incredibly difficult to get any sense of how useful any of that information is. So we don't honestly know in a compelling way whether that is a high prevalence issue or a reasonably low prevalence issue. Clearly, we would all agree that on a planet with 7.5 billion people, one person being trafficked into sexual slavery is an abomination. But how common is this? That's a meaningful question that we haven't really answered. But before we get too far afield, and we'll dive into this quite a bit more, I wanted to talk to Daniel in Texas, who has some curiosity around what is being called the Great Sex Recession. Daniel, what's on your mind tonight?
Yeah, so I wanted to know your thoughts about that. And also, I want to point out on two studies. Okay, so there's this study done by Lindbergh and Firestein. That was in 2020. And what Lindbergh and Firestein found is that there's a trend of young adults having less sex. As a matter of fact, they conclude that by the time 20-year-old males reach 20, 40% are still virgins, according to the study.
Sure. And that particular study aside, I will definitely say that there is sort of a narrative anyway in popular culture right now. I've seen a number of articles referencing this great sex recession that particularly exacerbated by COVID and possibly or probably by depressed wages for young folks, that there is a lot less sex being had by younger generations, or that people are having much less sex in their teens and 20s than they did maybe 20 years ago. I'm not entirely sure how to feel about that. I think there are a lot of ways to sort of explain it away as a symptom of other issues within our nation. But Daniel, I guess I'm curious what your interest was here, or maybe what your concerns are.
Yes. So according to a study, that was the recession started in 2015. So since 2015, people have been having less sex. And so I also want to point to another study called
well, Daniel, if I may, can you tell me what your interest in all of this is, regardless of what we do or don't know to be happening? What's your concern here, or maybe your question?
Well, my question, I wanted to know your thoughts because there's another study. It says here that having less sex could lead to like poor mental health. It says here that starting sex very late could in fact affect you, according to this other study published by.
Yeah, we'll certainly say that it is going to affect you, that having sex at a older age versus a younger age is going to have a potentially meaningful change in your life. But that's going to be so individual. And I definitely don't think that we could sit here and say, well, I suppose that if you're not having sex by 17, you should probably work on that. Or, if you hit 25 and it hasn't, oh my God. I don't think that there is any reason to believe that that sort of stance is going to be useful here. Certainly, attitudes around sex are constantly changing and evolving. And it is curious that we would learn that perhaps teenagers are likely having less sex than they used to. And then we, watch Euphoria on Sunday nights and we get all anxious about it. And I don't know that any of us could really be the arbiters of how our nation should feel about that issue. But I also don't think it's fair to say that it's a singular issue. There are so many contributing factors to all of this, and the trend lines, whatever they might be, are kind of unimportant to me in the face of like individuals and how they're living their lives. And to me, the thing to get most excited about here, or to maybe find some solace in, is the fact that for better or for worse, I think much, much, much for the better, there is a lot more access to information about sexuality for teenagers. Arden, Johnny, what would y'all maybe add to all this?
Go ahead, Arden, but
I was
go
just
ahead,
going to
Arden.
say that I would like to hear more from Daniel about exactly what his angle is on this. And because I know I think, I understand that maybe if there is like demonstrable harm that can be caused, that's a bad thing. I mean, I personally love sex. I know I haven't had less sex since 2015. But like, I don't even necessarily know if that's always a bad thing. If by 40% of men or boys have just, or I guess they're men by 20 have decided haven't had sex, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, that could be a choice. I I guess, and I don't really know what the solution would be, right? Like, how are we supposed to? If you're just here to advocate for empowering young people to like have a positive view of their sexuality and their bodies and relationships with each other, then I absolutely totally agree with that. But outside of that, I don't really know what like actionable steps could be taken with regard to these trends, which I think is maybe kind of what Christy was touching on with the trends themselves are like meaningless in this context, right? Like it is maybe concerning, but like why are we talking about it? Like, is there something we want to do? And if so, what?
Well, and I'm honestly wanting to
Well-
kind of dismiss a lot of the data that we have here because of the way that it's collected, because of all the complications in getting that data. And then, honestly, just the fact that we've been having this conversation for some 5 odd minutes and we've all been using the word sex, I think more or less with the assumption that we're talking about intercourse. Potentially, sex between two women or two men is getting lumped in there, kind of, maybe, but there's not a lot of consideration for what sex even means. The reality is, all of these survey respondents saying that they have never had sex at 18, at 20, at whatever age, have almost certainly been masturbating for 5 or 10 years by the time they're taking this survey. And the fact that we're not considering that as part of the equation really says to me that we're not even necessarily asking the right questions. But Daniel, let you jump back in here.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I want to share my personal experience. So I was very religious, and so I lost my virginity at age 26. And now I'm kind of young still, but I am having problems. So I don't know if losing my virginity late affected me. So, yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
Well, okay, let me ask the question then, because I think Christy was trying to get at it before. What do you think about the studies that you've read about folks not having sex quite as much as they used to, or whatever that means? What are your thoughts? Share them with us. Not your own experience, which is great, but what do you think? What does that tell you about the world we live in?
Right. So the studies are like at this point are still speculating. So they're still collecting data.
Mm-hmm. If it's true, what do you think?
Well, that's a very good question. So I honestly don't know what to make of them because, I mean, from my personal experience, I am having problems.
What are your problems?
And I am
tell me about the problems. Like, what's that?
Well, yes, I am having problems like sexually.
Yeah, I might jump in here and suggest, Daniel, without wanting to tell you about yourself. Certainly, as a stranger over the internet, I want to be mindful in trying to put any kind of label on anything that you're experiencing. But I don't necessarily know that it would be reasonable to think of the fact that you didn't have sex until 26 as the reason that you're currently having sexual issues, so much as there's probably a correlation. There's probably a connection between what you're experiencing now and the sexual shame and the religious trauma that led you to make that decision in the first place.
I heard medical issues, Daniel. Are you telling us, and if you again, you don't have to share, but we appreciate when you do. Are you saying that you're having medical issues, challenges in having sex? Is that what you're saying? Or did I get you wrong?
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
Okay.
That is correct. So So I have a ED. I have like problems getting aroused.
Okay.
Mhm. And those concerns can very, very, very much, in fact, the vast majority of time, be attributed to cognitive concerns, to the way that you think about sex. And I have to imagine that if you were in a religion that put a bunch of shame and restrictors on you, such that you felt that you were not able to have sex until a older age, that you're likely still working through a lot of those same things. And I'm not here to say that anybody is made better or worse because they had sex at prom or after graduation or after college, or, I mean, whatever track you're on is your own personal journey. And I don't think that it's necessarily fair to say that it's going to be positive or negative for anybody to have sex at any particular age. But if there's a reason why you perhaps hesitated, or if there was a lot of messaging that pressured you to have sex when you weren't ready, or that restricted you from having sex when you wanted to, then those same forces are going to continue to have some sway in your life until you're able to really process them and work through them in such a way that you find a health for you.
Daniel, and of course, I want to hear from Arden as well, but I got a bunch of questions here. All right. When you say you said ED, so you're having erectile dysfunction. No shame in that. Is that true?
Okay.
Did I hear that right?
Yes, I believe I am. Correct.
Okay. And are you able to? I'm not a baseball fan, but I'm going to say, how many times at bat would you say you get a chance to test out the efficacy of your genitalia?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer that. I do want to mention that I was a Mormon. So, yeah, I was
Do you
part of a
Yeah.
very strict religion.
Yeah. Daniel, do you go on dates? Do you go on dates with people of whatever sex or
Yes,
gender you are attracted to?
Yes, I do.
You do. How many a month would you say?
I don't know, three times a month on average.
Okay. Do you have a steady partner, or are these new people that you're meeting, or describe the people that you are getting into these sexual situations with, if you would?
Yes, I actually have a steady partner, and then
Okay.
I go out with other people.
Okay. So you have a steady partner and you go out with other people for having sex with new people, or you go out with friends?
Yes, sex. I mean, any like a romantic, experience.
Okay. So you have a steady partner and you were looking for sex out there in the wild. Is that true? Is that accurately describe
Yes,
your dating situation?
yes, that is correct.
And does this steady partner consent to you going out looking for sex in the wild? Does this partner know that you're going out looking for sex in the wild?
Yes.
And again, it's anonymous here, so you can answer however you want.
Okay. Well, not really.
Not really. Okay. Well then, how do you feel about that?
Wow.
How do you feel about that situation?
I don't know. Honestly, I just want to get it all out because, as I said, I was a Mormon when I was younger. So,
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
I
I mean, it definitely
pretty much
sounds like
mental.
there are some complications around anxiety, perhaps because the life that you're leading doesn't line up with your own values. And that's certainly something for you to wrestle with, not anything for me to label or to enforce upon you. But that is one of many things that can cause so-called ED. I'm not personally a fan of that term because I feel like it is a bit of a misnomer and perhaps pathologizes things in a way that we don't need to. But I do want to say that if you're not having the erections that you're expecting or hoping to, the overwhelming likelihood is that it is something to do with how comfortable you feel with the choices that you're making, with how anxious you might feel in the moment, or how distracted you might be because of sensations of guilt or a number of other things. And that guilt might be something like your religious beliefs that you have sort of intellectually moved past, but that still linger on.
Correct.
Or it could be something grounded much more close to home, as Johnny's kind of suggesting here.
Yeah, there's lots of ways to get it on, and both with the partner that you are with steadily or your side pieces, you can pleasure the other people. And perhaps, again, I am not a sex therapist, nor am I an erotic counselor in any way. However, you don't need a penis to do stuff.
Yep, especially an erect penis. Like
Yes.
I haven't talked for a little bit, but I'm just kind of taking in a lot of this information because I think Johnny was doing a good job of sussing out exactly maybe where these issues are. And I will say, Daniel, that I've been around the block before, and I've been with people of many different body types and degrees of functionality. And I think Johnny really hit it on the head that you absolutely don't need. It sounds to me, and maybe I'm wrong. Feel free to correct me if that is the case. But it sounds like maybe you're like kind of giving yourself an expectation of like this is what my sex life should be like, and this is what would be like maybe even normal, perhaps. And that's not where I'm at. And maybe I think that sounds like that would be more of the issue, the source of some of these issues. Because I can tell you that I've had uh, the amazingness of the sex and the satisfaction that comes afterwards has very little to do with how well my partner's living up to some expectation as much as like how present they were in the moment with me and responding to my desires and me responding to their desires. I think those things are more prevalent. And I think the heavier of a burden of meeting those expectations you put on yourself, it's probably going to be harder and harder for you to rise to the occasion of those expectations.
Pun intended. Daniel, are you meeting with? Do you have the ability to consult with a therapist?
Well, I do want to get a therapist.
All right.
Yes, I've been wanting to do that for quite a while now. I haven't had the chance, but yeah, when I get the chance, I would like to see a therapist.
I'll tell you, I it took me some time, and it's been some time since I saw my counselor. Um, but it took me years to get the gumption up to, I got to sit down. I got to look through some people. I've got to figure out what my insurance covers. It's like going to the dentist. Like, I don't want to do it. I know I don't want to do it. And then I did it. And I found it to be very beneficial. And it got me thinking about myself and my life and my interactions with people in a different way that brought new spectrums of color and light and sensations to my interactions. I was not thinking of the multitude of ways I could be living my life and interacting with people and seeing how my actions affected others and how others affected me. And so perhaps, although you already said you wanted to, perhaps looking forward to the new world that could be yours by consulting with the right therapist for you. And it might not be the first person you find. It may be 2-3 therapists in before you find the person that really has a style and you have an interaction that works in a meaningful way for you. So I would encourage you to do not delay, to seek out a therapist that works for you at your earliest practicable availability, and maybe call back with new thoughts that you have as a result of this therapy.
All right. Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your advice.
Yeah, we certainly appreciate your call, and I hope that we've been able to help you wrap your mind around some of this. But I definitely do think that if you are struggling with not getting the erections that you want to be having, that a therapist is a great place to start. So good
right.
luck.
Well, that's
Give us a call and update us.
Thank you.
And thanks for calling.
I will. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Daniel.
All right. Well, there is so much more that I want to jump into. But first, let's take a moment to see what's been going on around the rest of the ACA.
Clearly enjoying themselves and having fun, but it's only from the point of view of the shoulders. And that's all you can see is their face. I thought that was super, super interesting. It's a beautiful agony, I believe is what they call it.
Just not interested.
I think you're pushing an agenda there that's harmful to children in some cases.
I'm pushing an agenda for damn sure. And it's that trans kids have rights.
The conversations that were in sexual education concerning sex and the conversations that I were having with my friends were completely different. And they were wrought with misinformation.
Like whenever I hear people doing the preacher voice, I wonder what they sound like when they're going through like the drive-through at Taco Bell. That's like how they sound.
Number 2,
I would
like a
no
lettuce and a chalupa.
You'd stamp your foot and be like, no, Mom, I don't want to go do the dishes. Well, tough. You're doing the dishes anyway, and that's your job for the next 75 years.
That's right. It's been mandated to you.
All right. Well, there are a number of different models being proposed for what we should be doing about the quote, like problem of prostitution. And we're, going to continue to kick some of those around. But at least one idea that seems to be gaining traction, at least if the Fox News article that I have linked in the show notes is to be believed, is for local municipalities and counties to basically just selectively enforce anti-prostitution laws. And Johnny, I know you've said before on the show that can be a really slippery slope, but I was hoping you could sort of walk us through some of the concerns around that idea that maybe is catching on.
What I've seen in the research that I did was that you have examples of many sex workers have reported that they have been propositioned by police officers, as in, if you give me this sexual favor, I won't report you for selling sex or sexual favors of some kind. And I guess where I'm coming up with that is the police are charged with enforcing the law. The police are supposed to follow the guidance given to them by the legislatures of their communities and the executive branch, administrative regulations, whatever it might be. It is not up to the patrol person, the street cop, to say, I'm gonna enforce this with regard to person X, but not person Y. This speaks back to Arden's comment about how prosecutions overwhelmingly are taken against people of color. And I just don't think that giving cops that discretion is going to result in more fairness. I would rather they act like martinets and just enforce it equally across the board. I don't want police chiefs to do it either. Police chiefs are essentially administrators, not policy people, not social justice warriors, not legislators that are responsible to the people and to an electorate. Not really. They are removed from that process in large part. And so I just want them to be following orders. So to the extent that police departments are choosing not to enforce laws, I'm going to be against it. Because today's, I'm not going to enforce the law because I don't think it's right to oppress this group of people, can be tomorrow's, you know what else? I think I'm just going to enforce some laws that don't exist. And maybe I can't write them up for it, but maybe there's some higher law that I should be enforcing.
I definitely hear the concern. I'm curious as we have this patchwork system, if this isn't expedient on the way towards something a little bit more reliable. But I definitely hear the worries about where this could all lead. I wanted to make sure to also just briefly cover the Nordic model, but before we jump into that, Arden, did you have something you wanted to add here?
Uh, Not particularly. I mean, I
Sure.
definitely agree that I think I do have fears about selective enforcement of laws. And I think that considering how fraught the relationship already is between sex workers and police for reasons that I think Johnny pointed out, and I think as we've seen in America, we have some significant issues with the culture of law enforcement officers. Uh, I do think I would rather see consistency than some of these approaches, but I don't know. I'm not a all-knowing person to know what would be the most effective. So
Yeah. Well, as we're sort of building this hypothetical like patchwork system or trying to wrap our heads around what currently exists, we at least briefly mentioned the term, but can y'all walk the audience through the rationale behind the Nordic model and what that idea really means?
yeah, I mean, sure. Uh, so my understanding of the Nordic model is that it was an approach where the sex worker, the seller, would not be criminalized, but the purchaser would be criminalized, and this was more or less a goal that would reduce overall sex work because there was no incentive for buyers to go, which would kind of like choke out the market. But it seems and protect sex workers in the meantime while like a transition to like a I don't know, a society without that presumably uh would take place. But it seems to be that this has kind of resulted in more or less of the same as criminalization of people not being able to talk to law enforcement officers when things go poorly, what engagements they do have going even more poorly, leading to violence, kind of in the vein of Johnny mentioned of maybe being propositioned by a law enforcement officer themselves. So it's a muddy situation, and it doesn't seem to be effective in from what I've seen.
Yeah. So ultimately, with all of these things on the table, would either of y'all be willing to sort of put forth your, sex positive utopia idea of what could work or what sex for sale should look like in any sort of rational country? What do y'all think? Fantasizing here.
Okay, I'll fantasize right now. The only people who get into sex work are people who just love fucking, and that there are opportunities available to anyone who wants to do anything else, and that no one feels they have to do it. Or maybe they do it as a part time job just for fun. That that there is no social stigma for going to one of these folks who is a provider, that you can be guaranteed that everyone has proper safety measures in place, both before you get there and then while you're there, and that there is no danger of being harmed or abused unless you are fully consenting to do so, that you can call it off whenever you feel like it, that if someone were to approach a sex worker to be a manager, that person, I don't know, has to be licensed or something. And that if you're discovered to be a underhanded, abusive, nasty person who is trying to be a manager of sex workers, well, then the full force of the law comes down on you, and you will not be seeing a whole lot of good days until you change your ways. And everyone lives happily ever after, orgasmed out of their brains.
It's a nice fantasy.
If they want it.
Arden,
Unless
would
they don't
you
want to.
add or change anything to that?
Maybe in bits and pieces. I mean, kind of like the way you framed it, like utopia and like maybe feasible, where those kind of maybe come into conflict to a certain
Right, for
degree.
sure. And we'll keep going with that.
Yeah, like I definitely agree that I would love for all exchanges of sex work to be you know legal and permissible, and everyone's going to be enthusiastically consenting, and everyone wants to be there, and anyone who takes advantage of anyone else will be met with the appropriate repercussions. I I mean, I'm a humanist. I want to see reduction of harm to people, and I want to
Hmm.
see them grow and flourish and be able to be happy and have good experiences that aren't harming other people. That's kind of what I'm thinking. And I also think that for me, the reason as a sex worker that I think decriminalization is my preferred utopia is purely because of the the bureaucracy that I presume, perhaps wrongfully, but that I presume would be involved with legalization. I think one of the great aspects of sex work is that it's so accessible. It doesn't matter
Hmm.
what marginalized group you come from, if you're disabled or if you're able-bodied or if you are whatever, it's open for everyone, and the pay is the payoff for the work, while the work is maybe not always like exactly what you would want to do with like your partner or something, is so worth it that it actually is like can lift you out of poverty. Or like for trans people, until we see healthcare, uh, a lot of trans people are going to rely on sex work to afford their surgeries. I mean, a lot of medical intervention for trans people is insanely expensive,
Mm,
especially if you want to go to a competent doctor and not just the one in your town.
sure.
So like for me, I think I would like to see less hands in the gig. I think that's
I
part of my fear
appreciate
with
that.
legalization is
Decriminalization versus legalization, like trying to remove that regulation and all of those extra folks.
yeah, I think that would personally, I think that would be more empowering to workers. But uh, maybe it looks like Johnny is itching to counter me. So bring it on, Johnny.
It sounds like we should all be tipping more. Whereas instead, what we ought to be doing is giving servers a living wage.
Sure.
And so rather than saying, oh, we should open sex work up to all these folks who maybe need a way out of poverty, a way to pay for necessary surgeries for their well-being. Yeah, that'll fix it. Maybe. This is crazy. Maybe we should just make these things available to people because, in large part, they are necessities for many people. Not for me, but for others.
Mm.
And so, why let the market decide who gets what? Why don't we? I pay a lot of fucking taxes, all right? And I'm fine with it. But I want my money to go toward making the lives of individuals better and for society to be steered toward a world where more people can have spiritual and physical and emotional fulfillment. And if that means I'm paying for my tiny share of a surgery, so be it. One less B-2 bomber, please. Not
Sure.
no B-2 bombers, because I'm sure we need B-2 bombers, right? But maybe not as many as we have.
I mean, that's kind of where I was saying, like, this is the issue with where utopia meets reality, right? I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you beyond the shadow of the doubt. Workers need to be paid a livable wage. They need to be able to
Mhm.
afford housing and food and healthcare. We should be giving people healthcare without them having to pay for it. But if we're talking about operating within the systems that exist currently, this is what I think seems to be the best path towards solving some of those issues until we can implement, which I agree. I would happily pay more taxes than I pay if I knew that it was going towards the things that it needs to go for. But currently, it's not. And so I think a model that considers the current circumstances of people is more prudent.
Sure, and I would definitely say that my answer, I mean, philosophically, I would like to be in a fully decriminalized circumstance, full stop. But the more I read about it, the more I learn about what it looks like in New Zealand, what it looks like in Australia, what it looks like in the Netherlands and these different places, is that in order for that to be at all palatable to me, you need to have a social safety net that just doesn't exist in this country by any means. So, what to do moving forward? I think you have to kind of look at two questions. One is, what would you actually like to see? And then, yeah, what is at all practical? So, regardless of how you feel about the current model or where you want to go, what really feels more realistic in terms of seeing meaningful reform passed in this country in the next decade? Broadly speaking, is that legalization or is that decriminalization or some kind of hybrid?
I think it's going to be legalization. I think we'll see sex licenses or something like that.
Sure.
You said something.
Okay.
What was the country that did a universal basic income or toyed with it? What country was that?
I couldn't say. It's been an idea that's been flirted with around the world.
But supposing a country had a universal basic income and you were able to control for illicit sex trafficking, which doesn't necessarily mean sex trafficking from someone far away to your community. It could mean within your community as well. Let's be realistic. Sex trafficking happens in our own backyards.
Sure.
But supposing you could eliminate that somehow. I don't know how. I'm afraid to imagine how you would eliminate all crime. But if you had a universal basic income, then accounting for the fact that there were no sex trafficked individuals, then the only people who might be engaging in the sex trade might just be the horny who enjoy the work. And I think that'd be kind of nice.
Certainly. And I mean, I think I might agree with you in the sense that if we're asking what's palatable in the minds of broadly American people, I certainly think Americans are more comfortable with this is condoned by the state, this is legalized, than this has been a hands-off approach. I don't disagree with you that I think it may be more feasible realistically to get Americans to vote for a legalization measure over a decrim measure.
Yeah.
But that said, we don't really have any examples to point to say if that's actually the case. And I would still stand by that even if Americans would do that, Americans can be pretty fucking stupid sometimes and don't always vote for their best interests.
Sure.
And I would still argue that the better method or the better approach for sex workers would be decriminalization, even if I think maybe it's more actionable.
And I could be wrong here, but it would seem that decriminalization, while perhaps less palatable to the American public if it were, say, put on a ballot measure, might be easier to pursue legally than a legalization structure that then has to figure out, okay, so how are we taxing this? Who's managing it? So is there anything then that we can learn from the kind of currently like stymied efforts to legalize marijuana?
Well, from the stymied efforts to legalize marijuana, those states who have done so have, I believe, enjoyed a windfall of tax revenue because businesses get involved in it, but not without consequences. I had some friends who were drug treatment counselors. They would never do any drugs because they could not do drugs, but they would get fucked up beyond all recognition on alcohol because they could do that. Nevertheless, they told me about the state of driving under the influence of marijuana problems in Colorado, that there was no reliable test for marijuana, for being high, measuring it to see if somebody were actually...
There's not a breathalyzer type mechanism for really getting like an actionable number to put a lot to.
Yeah, not yet. And as a result, there were increases. And of course, the chat and I could look this up to see that there was an increase in unsafe driving that, although some people think that's cool, results in death and disfigurement, and innocent people are harmed. I wonder if there's a parallel there, that while the state raked it in on revenue, we may also see irresponsible or law-skirting individuals who would try to get their share of the bucks and cut all the corners to do so. Because, shoot, you get a regulation, then you find an attorney who can find a way around it, and then there are victims. But like we said before, they're already victims. So what's the best way of minimizing the victims? I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah, I think maybe in a similar vein to the way that a lot of the changes following legalization, I think we'd probably see, if we were to take a legalization approach, very similar consequences. Maybe not even just in these like unforeseen down the road other consequences, but I think we'd also see probably, and I kind of touched on this earlier, less justice happening than we would hope with regards to the racial disparity, and that's kind of why I keep harping on that point so hard, because I know in Massachusetts, following legalization, they specifically gave grants to people of color and communities of color that were the most harmed by bad marijuana policies, which was because that wasn't happening in other states that legalized it, and it was kind of like, you know, people of color were the most marginalized and the most prosecuted for these crimes, and then it became legal, and it was like just white people benefited and not much really changed for the conditions of people of color. I suspect we could see some similarities there as well,
Yeah.
with a legalization effort. And I would say that I know I touched on it earlier, but the ballot measure in Oregon specifically has provisions to, again, meet every 2 years to review this stuff and to say, like, hey, how did we do? Did we live up to our expectations? Did we actually reduce harm? Was the funds that were reallocated spent well? So, I mean, we do have to, again, try something, because as we've said many times, it's not working as it is right now.
It's not working.
Well, I'm just picturing the low likelihood possibility of my father stumbling across a video of me on the internet discussing a model for legalizing prostitution that has like differential outcomes for people based on race, particularly trying to favor marginalized races. We're through the looking glass, right? Like these ideas, as fraught as they might be, are also kind of fantasy in a lot of ways. So knowing the fact that we've made very, very little progress and that we are possibly flirting with the potential for change, even while we're all saying that, goddamn, something's got to happen, are either of you willing to grab your crystal ball and make some form of prediction about how things might look different 50 years from now?
Yeah, Arden, you wanna look in your crystal ball first, and then I can look in mine, or
It's so hard to say. I feel like, generally speaking, I'm an optimistic person. I think maybe I've even heard this from Christy the first time, that the curve of progress, or the arch of progress, is a long one, but it generally goes in the right direction. I think I tend to believe that. But that being said, we are still wrestling with issues of like racial equality in America, you know, when it comes to like voting rights and things like that. There are a lot of aspects to these issues that are old and haggard for hundreds of years that have found no real resolution still, because unfortunately, with a country so large and with such diverse culture, because I mean, you know, the voters in California are not going to feel the same about this as the voters in rural Nebraska might feel about it. Um, it's really hard to know. There are so many things that I can think of that could get in the way of progress, or that could really slow things down. I would like to think we would have tried something and we would have learned from it, and we would have maybe still probably an imperfect system, but one that's significantly better than we do now. But I really don't know. So many horrible bills get proposed every year in so many states, and it's like, man, I don't always have as much faith in American people as I do the march of progress.
oh,
Fair.
yeah. Look at the bills that come out of the Texas legislature sometime, Arden, and you'll be sad. I know someone who helps work on those, and he's been doing it for years. And this last session has made him the most depressed. Here's my prediction. Excuse me. Whatever regulatory scheme can benefit a privileged few or a class of individuals with political hegemony, that will be the one that prevails. So if regulation will result in a means by which certain individuals can rake it in on cash legally, perfectly legally, then that will be the one that is done. The whatever regimen keeps the money into the hands of the little guy, in quotation marks, that will be the one that is not passed. And I'm generally pretty positive, but I'm also incredibly cynical about this. I anticipate that within the next 50 years, we will see one or two states pass something similar to what is in Nevada, but maybe not with the county size limitations, the population limitations, maybe something, maybe California, maybe New York, heavily regulated scheme. It will go into the hands of those with the capital to invest in those operations, and it will be decried by folks in the countryside and folks in more religious areas as being the devil's work, and it will be used as a political leverage for those who would call for its complete abolition as a means to take control of power again and get elected into high offices. That's my prediction.
Bleak. And I hear it. I think if we did this episode of the show, 3 years ago, I probably would have said something about how OnlyFans is making sex work much more like common or palatable. You know, when you find out that your sister-in-law or that your coworker is working in the sexuality sphere, and you're not picturing them in a like a smoky strip club, that's going to naturally change our relationship with it. And that's going to impact voters. And then, point to things like the conversations that we're having about gender and about orientation and some of the like meaningful advances in the sex positivity of our nation. And I'd really like to get all excited and humanistic about it, but I just don't know that I can right now. The backlash in the culture war is incredibly upsetting, and it's hard to know what will happen. But I think I really share the skepticism that both of you are expressing here. So ultimately, my question becomes, what do we do about it? Not what should our government decide to be working on, but for regular people watching this right now, what insignificant or perhaps even significant steps could we possibly be taking to create a nation that has at least a vaguely, slightly healthier relationship with the commerce of sexuality?
I'll go first this time.
Yeah.
Break the back of religious control over our society. Continue to teach people skepticism and tolerance, except for intolerance. Don't teach tolerance for intolerance, because that's a fake dichotomy. Don't shame people for exploring their own personal sexuality, and don't blame people for what they're trying to do with their lives. But recognize that everyone has their own personal journey, and it's not always sunshine and roses. Sometimes it can be bleak, but don't assume also that your way is the only way. And so I think stop being shitty, be more supportive and loving and available to help people. And over time, perhaps the world will change for the better.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I think, it's going to require people to be more comfortable with sexuality, generally speaking, for them to be comfortable with the commerce of sexuality. I think we need to separate sexuality from being this super intense, magical, unique thing that, if you, the word virginity is like sacred and it's something to be concerned about if you haven't lost it yet. I think those are some of the things that cause people to not have a great relationship with sexuality and probably therefore with the commerce of sexuality. I think people need to be comfortable with the idea that humans have been fucking for a long time. We like to do it, generally speaking, and people should be allowed to engage in that to what extent they do or don't want to. And that shouldn't impact how you view a person's quality. I think things like I know for a lot of women feel that if they aren't sexualized, that their value is less than, and like
Sure.
those things need to stop. I think the value of someone's character is far more important than how little or how significantly they engage in open sexuality. Um, but yeah, I think it's going to take some broad cultural shifts, and that's not easy to do. That takes a lot of time. I do think sometimes state body enforcement of things can help nudge society in the right direction.
Mm.
But I do think it's going to start with people talking to each other. So.
Yeah. Well, and this might be something of a cheerful nihilism type thought, but even as we are acknowledging and really worrying about, I don't want to make a comment or joke about like wringing our hands, because sincerely, we're talking about meaningful, terrible issues that exist now and could be amplified or made worse by these things. We're talking about sexual slavery. We're talking about people being assaulted in terrible and despicable ways, people being intimidated by the police and by other aspects of their government. But I suppose in the wake of all of that, I want to at least point out that these are definitely issues that exist right now. They're not necessarily something that are exclusive to the sex sphere, or issues that are going to explode or disappear with any of the legislation that we're discussing here. These are very real problems that are currently existing, and I would like to think that as we become more willing to dive into this data, more willing to engage in these discussions, that we can bring some of that out into the light and put a little bit of focus and attention on it, naturally on our way to making some sort of meaningful change, where regardless of what that change ends up looking like, whether we're leaning into decriminalization or legalization or any of these other ideas. But very much appreciate y'all being here tonight and having this conversation with me. I want to go ahead and remind the audience about a way for them to catch this show as well as all of the Atheist Experience Network's other shows in one quick stop shop. That's at tiny.cc/AEN podcast, where you can find all of our different shows grouped together in an audio only format. There's obviously a lot more to be talked about with this conversation. There's so much information, so much debate to be had. Frankly, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics about every aspect of what we've discussed. So join in that conversation by finding us on the Secular Sexuality Facebook fan group, where you can find more of the research that we've been discussing and jump into the conversation about what's going on here. I'll also say that there's a lively debate around this and many other interesting topics in the atheist community of Discord, which you can find at tiny.cc/ACD Discord. And of course, I want to invite people to get their own secular sexuality gear. It's not just for hanging on the wall behind you. You can find your own at tiny.cc/merchaca. And finally, I want to do the most important part of every episode, which is when we take a moment to recognize that it's not just the three of us standing up here pretending to understand the world, but in fact, a whole cast of folks that work incredibly hard to make this show happen. This show in particular, I really have to say there was a lot of complications in the run-up and the preparation, and I'm just so thankful to everybody in the crew that worked to make this happen. So I want to take a quick moment to show their smiling faces and thank y'all for all of your incredible hard work. But ultimately, before we walk out tonight, I wanted to touch with both of you to just see what kind of final thoughts do you want to leave with the audience, because this is a big, complicated question. And I'm really curious what sorts of final impressions you'd like to walk away with tonight.
Well, I I would like people to, and I think by and large, society is moving in this direction. I think we're moving away from the notion that people who sell sex are the bad people in the situation, right? I think there are instances where sex workers are victims and they need to be cared for, definitely, and justice needs to be served for however they were harmed by the industry. That said, I think I would like to see people moving away from this idea of sex workers as people who need to be criminalized. That's the biggest thing, right? Whether it's legalization or decriminalization, the people selling sex aren't the people who are doing any harm here. The people who are getting harmed are the people selling sex most of the time. Uh, so I think that's what I want people to leave with is just this notion that what's happening right now, the current system, it's not working. It's harming sex workers and it's overwhelmingly harming people of color and marginalized people. And that's not okay. We gotta change that. That's not acceptable.
Totally
Yeah.
co-signed. Johnny, how about you?
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that. I think that society is looking at things a little bit differently than they used to, than we used to, and a change is needed. And that change needs to include not demonizing the sex workers out there. Just like Arden said, I don't know what the answer is, but something needs to happen, and careful, cautious, researched, data-driven approaches to solving what ultimately is a problem with the way we mistreat human beings is that's the focus there, because you're not going to stop people from selling sex. It's just never going to happen. So let's figure out a way to make it so that everyone is consenting and that everyone is protected in the best possible way we can. And maybe that's a societal change. I know it's a societal change, but it's also a legal change as well. So I'm going to be staying tuned to this issue, and conducting research as a result of preparing for this show has gotten me interested in the question. And hopefully, when more data comes out, I will read it, and I will incorporate it to my already very undetermined determinations as to what the right thing to do is.
Yeah, I know I've said this more than once tonight, but the more I learn, the more I'm convinced I don't know anything about this issue. Yeah. Well, on that very cheery note, I do want to say again just how grateful I am to have had both of you on this show, the amount of work that went into it, and I think these are incredibly important issues. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, for working to wrap your head around some of these things. And I do hope that you will stay a part of the debate, that you will keep your eyes open to what's going on in the world and do what you can to make this a slightly better place. In the meantime, though, I definitely think that you've earned it. And it's probably a great time for you to take a quiet moment to yourself and give yourself a big old orgasm. Or better yet, give somebody else one.
Watch Talk Heathen live Sundays at 1 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTTH and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callth.